wish you all a good evening. My name is Kathy Frischman. I am a member of the Climate Change Committee of the League of Women Voters of Corvallis, and I will be serving as your moderator for tonight's presentation and questions and answers. On behalf of our many sponsors, I welcome you. We would like to thank Robert Peccano and Dr. Mina Carson from Oregon State University's School of History, Philosophy, and Religion for making the room arrangements and for serving as our audio tech wizards. We would also, thank you. We would also like to thank Charles Goodrich from Oregon State University's Spring Creek Project for room arrangements, Claudia Keith of the League of Women Voters of Corvallis for her passion to act on climate change, and all the volunteers who have helped with tonight's program. As communities across the country begin to grapple with the impacts of climate change, the state of Oregon, by its own admission, is failing to meet its carbon emission reduction goals. Recent polls show that 7 in 10 voters see climate change as a serious problem facing our country, and people are ready to talk about it and to look for solutions. The purpose of tonight's program is to educate and to motivate. The League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan political organization that encourages informed and active participation in government. We have organized tonight's program because we know that action is urgently needed to reduce carbon emissions, and we would like to know more about the options for doing so. Many of you who have decreased your carbon footprint know that by cutting carbon emissions and moving toward clean, renewable energy, we can build safer, stronger communities. But how can we accelerate current efforts to move in that direction? The League of Women Voters of the United States has been in the forefront of the environmental protection movement for decades, consistently supporting legislation to preserve our nation's natural resources, protect our public health, and providing pathways to economic prosperity. The League believes that averting the damaging effects of climate change requires action from both individuals and governments at the local, state, national, and international levels. The League in Oregon urges all Oregonians to acquaint themselves with the Climate, Sustainability, and Justice Act 2015, House Bill 3470. This bill is currently in the House Rules Committee. It requires Oregon to adopt statewide greenhouse gas emissions limits, along with an action plan to ensure compliance. We urge you to contact your representative to move this bill to a vote. Here is our agenda for the evening. During the next hour, we'll hear from our speaker. Following that, she will answer your questions taken from the floor, both orally and in writing. We do have persons in the aisles with cards, and if anytime you would like to get a card, just raise your hand and they'll give you one. And we will finish with a call to action. Our presentation tonight, our presenter tonight, is one of Oregon's environmental law experts and a fourth-generation Oregonian. She is the Philip H. Knight Professor of Law and Faculty Director and Founder of the Environmental and Natural Resources Law Center at the University of Oregon School of Law. She is the co-author of a textbook on natural resources law, has authored many articles and book chapters on the Federal Indian Trust Obligation, wildlife law, and climate crisis. She is the originator of a climate litigation approach now used across this country and in other nations, atmospheric trust litigation, spearheaded by the group Our Children's Trust. She and her husband have 3 boys. Her most recent book is Nature's Trust, Environmental Law for a New Ecological Age, and the title of tonight's talk. It is my honor to present to you Mary Christina Wood.
you so much. It is a tremendous honor to be here, and I am so grateful you all took time out of your evenings to spend this time talking about climate crisis and what citizens can do. And I just want to thank Claudia and Kathy and all the people that helped put this together, the League of Women Voters, the Oregon School of History, Philosophy and Religion, and the Spring Creek Project. I just have so much admiration for what you all do to inform all of us on these issues. I'm going to start with our moment in time. And notice it says moment, not week, not even month or decade. It's literally our moment in time, and that is why I'm here. And that is why I hope you are here, and I hope you will leave with an appreciation of what this means for each of us individually. Why is this our moment in time? The leading scientists are warning that our planet is in imminent peril. That is something no other generation of living beings on this planet has ever been told. And I think you will see from tonight's presentation that, excuse me, I have a little bit of allergy, that we don't have much time to protect the future for young people and their descendants. So that's why it's our moment in time. Tonight, I'd like to talk about first the climate crisis. I know a lot of you know much about it, but to bring us all on the same page, I'm going to go through a few facts and scenarios. And then we'll talk about law and whether it is responding to this crisis and how it can respond. And then we'll end with what an average citizen can do. So to begin with, on climate crisis, this has been brought on, as you know, by emissions of carbon dioxide, pollution, other greenhouse gases, and also methane. There's other factors I won't mention in this presentation, but the bottom line is we still emit 70 million tons of carbon dioxide every day across the planet, and that will linger, some of it, about half of it, for 100+ years, some of it even over 1,000 years. And so the gas you burn today will actually stay up there, some of in the form of carbon dioxide, will actually stay up there, and our future descendants will be dealing with the consequences from that. There's heating in the pipeline, and I'm sorry to say that many people don't even think about this or know about this, but all the carbon dioxide emissions that have been spewed out for the last, 100 and some years since the Industrial Revolution have accumulated in the atmosphere. And so what we're experiencing right now is not the end of it. There's heating that we will not be able to call back. Moreover, across the globe, carbon levels are increasing by about 3% a year. This is causing our planet to heat. We all know what the greenhouse effect is. If you sit in a car in the summertime, or even today, with the windows rolled up, it wouldn't be very long before you'd want that window rolled down. And yet there's no way we can roll the windows down on our planet. And so what we're in effect doing is causing a greenhouse that we will leave our future descendants, our children, to deal with. The hottest 14 out of 15 years have been since the millennium. The Greenland ice mass is breaking up. The West Antarctica glaciers and ice masses are disintegrating. Dr. Rigneau said the collapse of this sector of West Antarctica now appears to be unstoppable. There are now flood events caused by sea level rise on the East Coast without storms. NASA predicts that by the end of the century there will be a 3 feet sea level rise. More recently, NOAA predicted, that's another federal agency, up to 6 feet by 2100. 3 alone could displace tens of millions of people from coastal areas around the world because obviously there's so many big cities along the ocean front. If Greenland melts, which Dr. James Hansen, former head of NASA's Goddard Institute for Space Studies, predicts would happen with a 2-degree temperature rise, that would cause a 23-foot rise in sea level. The oceans are acidifying from all the carbon dioxide pollution we put in the atmosphere. Those get absorbed in the oceans. What happens is as they acidify, and they're 30% more acidic now than before the Industrial Revolution, As they acidify, they actually kill shellfish because they erode the shells of the fish as they're babies. This is affecting Oregon. At Oregon's Whiskey Creek Oyster Hatchery, they've seen larvae die-offs of 70 to 80%. In fact, the owner of that hatchery said everything was dying. The larvae were pink. Every larva in the place was not feeding. We're seeing now massive, epic drought in California, one more severe than has visited that area for 1,200 years. And California is a major food source for this state and for other states as well. It's not as if this is any surprise. Dr. Steven Chu, who was Secretary of Energy in the Obama administration until just a couple of years ago, told the LA Times in 2008, I don't think the American public has gripped in its gut what could happen. We're looking at a scenario where there's no more agriculture in California. I don't actually see how they can keep their cities going either. This is a picture of the California drought. Oregon is also in drought. There's ranchers, there are sixth-generation ranchers down in Lake County that don't know what to do with the scarce water supplies and how they will continue their livelihoods. This was at nearly 5,000 feet this winter at Hoodoo Ski Area. Oregon really hasn't had much of a winter for 2 years now. This is not just because of low precipitation. It's actually because of rising temperatures. And so right now we're looking at a snowpack in Oregon of about 15-16% of our average. The wildfires across western United States have grown. In fact, they're 75% greater in frequency and acreage burned than the 1980 to 89 period. And of course, Oregon had over 1 million acres of forest land lost last year. Pacific Northwest led the country in wildfires last year. When you have more energy coming in than can escape, the energy in the whole system is out of balance. And so that means there's going to be very, very intense storms, the likes of which we haven't seen before. Also a lot of flooding because more precipitation is up in the atmosphere. This was Arizona in 2014. What about the other species we share this planet with? Conservation biologists say we are starting the 6th planetary extinction, and that under the predicted rise in temperature, even if we do accomplish a 2-degree limit, which I'll talk about later, that would cause up to 30% of the plant and animal species to be threatened with extinction. We are seeing environmental refugees all over the world. People in Oregon are now talking about what if this is the last place in the West with water? What does that mean for our state? But across the world, this is a huge concern for the Defense Department and for national security. The U.S. military leaders have identified climate as an immediate military threat. This came out just a couple months ago. They view climate as a threat multiplier, and they say that climate conditions, and specifically drought, did contribute and have contributed to the conditions in the Middle East and Syria. Now, the problem here is not just what I've said. The problem is this. The problem is that at some point, this all spins out of our control. And this is why I started this talk tonight by saying this is our moment in time, literally our moment in time. Because there are dangerous feedback loops of nature that we can't control. And so if these feedback loops get going, even if we were to end all methane and carbon dioxide completely the next day, it would be too late. And this is why this is such a mind-blowing issue with such extraordinary urgency. What are those feedback loops? There's more than this, but I'll just tell you about 4. One is there's certain places on the Earth that absorb carbon dioxide emissions and that have historically absorbed our pollution. One is the oceans. But as I told you, the oceans are becoming saturated with carbon. They don't have a lot more capacity left. The forests also absorb our carbon dioxide pollution, but they are drying and burning. And then they're releasing stored carbon. They don't have capacity to just keep on absorbing all of our pollution. As the ice sheets on the in the polar reaches melt, what happens is that white, which is ice, turns to dark, which is water. And if you go outside on a hot day with a dark shirt as opposed to a white shirt, you'll notice that the colors will absorb different amounts of heat. And so what's happening here is the dark is absorbing more heat and it's not being reflected off that white sheet. So melting actually begets more melting. That's obviously a layperson's explanation. And then up in the northern latitudes, we've got stretches of permafrost. And those hold vast amounts of stored carbon and methane. Those are starting to melt. They're frozen, but they're starting to melt, and you can see these ponds. Once that gets going, if it does, if we push this system too far, it will melt so much, and there's so much stored methane and carbon that there again it spins out of our control and makes our carbon dioxide emissions look minimal. So what we're dealing with here is a situation where many of the past predictions are being blown out of the water with the intensity and speed of climate change and how fast it's coming. And we're literally at a tipping point. Jim Hansen, again, who I mentioned earlier, the former head of NASA's, former chief climate scientist, basically, has said the crystallizing scientific story reveals an imminent planetary emergency. We are at a planetary tipping point. So what happens if we just do tomorrow what we did today? Which is, of course, our normal inclination. No one really likes to stop and interrupt what they're doing to take care of the planet, of all things. So what if we just keep on going? Well, that's called business as usual. And under the UN predictions and other predictions, that will drive us into something akin to a 9 to 11 degree Fahrenheit increase over pre-industrial temperatures by the end of the century. So a child born today will experience this by the end of the century. I have yet to find a scientist who tells me that's survivable on a broad scale. In fact, the former dean of the School of Forestry and Environmental Studies at Yale University, James Speth, who wrote a book called Bridge at the Edge of the World, said, if we keep doing exactly what we are doing today, the world in the latter part of this century won't be fit to live in. So this is a time when we kind of need government leaders. We sort of need someone steering the ship, right? We need to plan, we need to respond. This gets a little more hopeful in a few minutes, but we do need we do need some people in government to wake up and start steering the ship. This is John Holdren, the President's science advisor, and what he said a few years ago, and it really hasn't changed. The current situation of the world in relation to the climate problem is that we're in a car with bad brakes driving towards a cliff in the fog. I would just add one thing has changed. Government's putting its foot down on the accelerator. We still don't have any comprehensive regulation of carbon dioxide. President Obama has proposed a rule. I'm not going to get into the intricacies of that rule. We still don't have comprehensive regulation in any state except for California, and don't have it on the federal level. But here's another problem. Despite President Obama's rhetoric about future generations and climate change, climate crisis, he is promoting fracking, coal mining in the Powder River Basin, drilling in the Arctic. He's oil drilling other places. He's doing things President Bush never actually accomplished. And all that is happening at full speed. It's also happening in Canada. This is the Canadian tar sands. And here's the problem. Scientists, more than one report, many reports, have determined the only way to go about this rationally is to think of this as of us having a carbon budget. It's as if our planet has a budget left of carbon before we push over those tipping points. Now, we can argue around the edges about what the carbon budget should be, but there clearly has to be a budget. And under the most, I would call this the most permissive budget, which goes to 2 degree centigrade heating over pre-industrial temperatures, which actually Dr. Hansen says is itself a recipe for disaster. But even under that, we would have to leave 80% of the fossil fuel reserves in the ground. And so you have many companies like Exxon, Shell, BP, other companies that have on their books reserves worth trillions of dollars. And they are counting on exploiting them and bringing them out of the ground. And yet the budget says we can't do that. And so we're entering a new era. We're entering an era where we have to think of being fossil-free rather quickly. Now here's the problem for our region. Whenever someone starts talking about regulation in a serious way or phasing out an industry, do you want to take a guess at what happens within that industry? You want to take a guess? Yeah, I think you got it, sort of. There's a run on the resource. It happens almost every time in environmental law. It's no surprise. There's a run on the resource. They're pushing harder to get this out and bring it to market. Well, the vast oil, gas, and coal reserves are in the interior United States. That's to the east of us. The vast markets for those fossil fuels are to the west of us in Asia. We are in the middle. And so our region has been targeted as the fossil fuel industry's gateway to Asia. And what we're seeing now is an onslaught of proposals for oil, gas, propane now, and coal export facilities all up and down the coast of Oregon and Washington and into British Columbia, simply because of the position we're in. There's now 16 export proposals that target just Oregon and Washington coasts, and those have all come up in the last 2 to 3 years. The oil trains through Oregon have increased 250% since just 3 years ago. Now, they're all, let me go back to this one. If you take all that fossil fuel and you figure out the emissions from all of it, the Sightline Institute has produced a report analyzing this and quantifying it and says this would be akin to 5 times the Keystone emissions, which most of you have heard of Keystone. That would be the project that would bring the Canadian tar sands down through the country. Now that in itself was declared enough to be, quote, game over, unquote, for the planet by Dr. James Hansen. We've got projects that accumulate to about 5 times those emissions. And they are, you can look at maps. There's coal maps, oil maps, gasoline maps, and so forth. And we're not going to spend time on these maps, but look them up. Sightline Institute and also Rising Tide organization have a full list of these projects and these maps. Well, now, don't read all these necessarily, but imagine someone like me trying to keep track of these. You know, I teach environmental law. Well, every single one of these projects implicates permits. So the government can deny. In fact, many agencies are involved in any one of these projects. And government could deny permits, stopping those projects. But from the public's perspective, can you imagine the stress on Oregon and Washington from people having to show up to these hearings and give testimony and keep track of them? And just in the last few months, we've added 4 more to this list. That's number 13 through 16. Well, people are showing up. People are waking up because this is not only a grave threat to the planetary system, it would put it over the edge, many scientists think. It's also a grave threat to our communities because of the dangers associated with the pollution and explosions, of which there have been 4 or 5 terrible oil train explosions in the last couple of years. People are rising across the Pacific Northwest in multiple ways. We're seeing many demonstrations in all areas of the Pacific Northwest. There's now a very vigorous None Shall Pass movement orchestrated by the group Rising Tide. And it tries to collect all of these projects and get citizen momentum behind stopping them. This is adding to other major demonstrations across the country and the planet. This was a picture from New York City in September. The People's Climate March drew 500,000 people. People are demonstrating at the origin of these fuels, the tar sands of Utah, where the stuff is extracted, gets onto trains and goes through Portland, Oregon. Well, you should know that people are demonstrating back there too. They're demonstrating against fracking and tar sand development in Canada. In 2013, the entire tribal council of the Nez Perce Nation just got up from a tribal council meeting, walked out, and formed a human blockade against a big megaload carrying equipment to the tar sands of Canada, and stopped that megaload for about 3 days. All over the world, people are rising. And they're doing it because they know the future will not be survivable if we continue on this path. Now, there's a little story to all this. As a lawyer, as someone who's taught environmental law for 22 years, what I see from all this is environmental law is really losing its legitimacy. It's fraying around the edges because, and I think I'll explain the reason in a minute. But let me tell you a little story of one such direct action involving a guy from Oregon. This is a huge ship in the background bringing coal to Massachusetts to a coal-fired plant. And in the foreground is just a little lobster boat. And two men, one from Oregon named Ken Ward and another man, got on that lobster boat and blocked this huge ship in the shipping lane. This is his name. This is Ken Ward. I've never met him. And they walked into court and they were terrified of their potential sentence and trial, and the DA seemed to have thrown the book at them with all the criminal charges. You can imagine it's quite an offense to do what they did. And when they got to court, the district attorney, Sam Sutton, walked in and surprised everybody. He held up Bill McKibben's article in Rolling Stones magazine that talked about the carbon budget. And he said, I'm dropping these charges. He said, this is really serious. We're in danger, and I can't represent the children of Massachusetts and bring charges against these men. I think they're right. And furthermore, he said, I'm going to be marching with them in New York City at that climate march. So there he is with Bill McKibben and the two defendants. So the point is, the sun is setting on fossil fuels, I would bet. It's a prediction, but it seems to be gaining more and more momentum. We often think of that as just a climate matter, but it's not just about climate. There's a whole lot of damage that fossil fuels has done that we have sort of accepted over the past decades, including the mountaintop removal in Appalachia. 500 mountains out there are beheaded because of coal mountaintop removal. Over 2,000 miles of streams have been buried from that practice. There's sludge ponds that are right up from a school. The huge amount of air pollution that comes from coal-fired plants, the mercury pollution that settles in lakes virtually all across the country, the asthma from the young people and the old people that comes from breathing all that has led to thousands and thousands of premature deaths. We've had terrific explosions from the BP disaster and others. Private property rights are imperiled. Along the Keystone route and along the Jordan Cove pipeline route in southern Oregon, there are condemnations. That's where government condemns huge swaths. These are not little easements. These are huge. Against private property. And people are losing their land so that corporations can go in and put in these pipelines. And so private property rights are very much on the line. And then, of course, people rely on wells for drinking water in many places, and those have been contaminated in many places in Pennsylvania and New York and so forth. And then there's the corruption of our democracy. Once the fossil fuel companies can't go on without production, we might wonder, maybe the money won't go into our democracy. I mean, that's sort of an impact. So what's the alternative? Here's Vancouver, British Columbia, and they have passed a unanimous city ordinance calling for all renewable energy in just 5 years. They want to be the greenest city on the globe. I think they need a little bit of competition from south. And so now we'll turn to the law. We've talked about the climate crisis, and we've talked about the potential future, but where does the law fit in? Well, the law is constantly changing, and the place I begin in all this is with our fundamental human rights. And I find those in the public trust doctrine. And we're starting with that because that underlies all environmental statutes that you've heard of or dealt with. And so these fundamental rights were expressed actually by the Pennsylvania Supreme Court Chief Justice just a year ago in a landmark public trust opinion. And he started by saying all citizens have certain inherent and indefeasible rights that are of such general, great, and essential quality as to be ensconced as inviolate. In other words, that's us. We hold indefeasible rights against our government. And these rights infuse a principle of constitutional nature that we call the public trust doctrine. What is the public trust? The public trust expresses the people's retained property rights, not private property rights, but rights held in common with all future generations, to the natural wealth that sustains us. It's like a trust. You all know what a trust is. A trust is wealth that is managed by one entity, a trustee, for the benefit of another. And so under our principles that go back to the early days of this nation, it's a principle that's already in every single state in this nation. It has been since the beginning. Under this principle, government is trustee of our natural assets, and present and future generations are the beneficiaries. And so government, as trustee, has a firm fiduciary obligation of a constitutional nature to protect our assets. This is a very deep principle, and it underlies all of our environmental laws and statutes. And I always like to begin there because when the people go up against these permitting agencies, they need to know the standing of their fundamental rights. It's the slate upon which all constitutions and laws are written. It's found in other countries as well. The major decision in this country that announced it years and years ago, and that should be 1892, sorry, was Illinois Central Railroad. And there the Supreme Court said the state can no more abdicate its trust over property in which the whole people are interested than it can abdicate its police powers. And there, the shoreline of Lake Michigan had been given away by the legislature, by the Illinois legislature, to a private railroad company. And the people wanted it back later, and the Attorney General sued to get it back, and the court said, yeah, it never should have been given away in the first place. That was a violation of the public trust. It was public property, and this is a grievance which never could be long borne by free people. And so you see, it's twin-born, if you will, with democracy. It's our public property rights that we need for the endurance of this nation. Well, what has happened is, over the last 40 years of our environmental law, the Earth Endowment, our trust, has been spent down dramatically, and now we're at this tipping point. How has that happened? Well, it's certainly not for lack of environmental laws. We had plenty of environmental laws passed in the 1970s, and these are the laws that I've taught for 22 years. And there's plenty of them, as you can tell. And people had a lot of hope in these laws. They were passed with great promise, and they did do marvelous things at first. Lead was taken out of gasoline, the pesticide DDT was banned. But over time, they got more and more complex, and industry started lobbying and pressuring the agencies that implement them. And what we have now is a system of environmental laws that are so complex, they're like gopher holes. And agencies are very siloed in their implementation. There's really very few that look at the big picture. They dig down deep into these laws, into these complex laws. And also what happens is they lose sight of the real laws, which are the laws of nature. And I call this selective pragmatism, because what we can observe from environmental law and the description of the state of the planet that I gave you at the outset is environmental law is now very disconnected from nature's laws. Environmental law that was connected with nature's laws would be stopping all these projects without the citizens even having to show up. Oren Lyons is a traditional Native leader, and I love this quote from him, because this is a concept that goes back to indigenous law. The thing you have to understand about nature and natural law is there's no mercy, there's only law. Whether you agree with it, understand it, comprehend it, it doesn't make any difference. You're going to suffer the consequence, and that's where we're headed right now. So why does environmental law give out so many permits? on average, about 99% of the permits are granted, not denied. So the permits that are granted carry some conditions on them, but oftentimes they simply add to the cumulative losses that reflect in today's crises. Well, the problems with environmental law are multifold, but one is that agencies have enormous discretion, enormous power under these laws. They've become politicized and captured because the industries have relentlessly pressured them over decades, and so they don't say no to permits very often. And then they use science oftentimes as a facade for justifying what is actually just a political decision. And then judges have fallen into this trap too, giving a lot of discretion to the agencies, believing that they are experts and that they are actually carrying out the laws in their scientific discretion. Well, that's the problem with the agencies. What about Congress? Can Congress lead the ship? Well, Congress, this was the last time Congress tried to do anything with climate. Now they're throwing snowballs. So we can't really expect our federal Congress too much right now. There's been deadlock in international treaties. That's probably not much of a surprise because until you get domestic will and legal regimes, you probably aren't going to see the nations come forth with any binding agreement. It all starts at the grassroots level and moves up from there. And so we have to ask, is the law relevant even? Well, I think it is, but I think we have to go below the statutes that are being implemented in a politicized way. And so going back to those inalienable rights, we focus on the public trust now. And that's why I wrote my book, to give definition to that public trust concept. And the public trust concept, to have any meaning today, must protect all the vital ecology, including the climate system. Well, here's that judge I told you about who rendered a landmark decision for the public trust. It was actually 100 and some pages, and this was about a year ago. And he stopped a law that had been passed by the Pennsylvania legislature to promote fracking. He said, this law promoting fracking violates the public trust. It violates the people's inalienable inherent rights to a habitable environment. So this public trust principle is the heart of a campaign to address climate called atmospheric trust litigation. And we're going to talk about this campaign. It's actually spearheaded by an organization out of Eugene called Our Children's Trust. Well, here's the approach of environmental statutory law to our current crisis. Just a lot of micro and procedural measures that many of which are not being implemented. Here's the public trust approach. It views the atmosphere as full common property, public property, for the benefit of present and future generations. And I also maintain for the benefit of all species on the earth as co-beneficiaries. So it is the classic macro approach. It looks at the atmosphere as one integral asset. And the organization Our Children's Trust brought cases and petitions on behalf of young people in every single state in this country in May of 2011. And those cases are proceeding now, and petitions across the United States, with more being filed all the time. And these are some of the plaintiffs from the various states. And here's our Oregon plaintiff, Kelsey Juliana. And I think her parents are here today. Is that right? Yep, I see them. Kelsey has been an amazing spokesperson for climate. Here's what the atmospheric trust claim says. It's very simple. In fact, the kids really get it. Sometimes the judges ask a lot of questions about each one, but the kids get it. First, the atmosphere is a trust asset. Well, navigable waters are settled trust assets and wildlife. Dry sand beaches in Oregon. The only way you can... How many of you have ever taken a walk on the dry sand beach of Oregon? Has anybody ever been to the beach and walked on the beach here? Anybody? 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 Everybody? That's all because of the public trust. So the public trust is, the beach has been declared basically a public trust asset to which the people have a right of custom. So with all of these assets, of course, the atmosphere is a logical trust asset as well. The sovereign nations and their subdivisions are then the co-trustees of this asset, and the citizens, all of us, would be the beneficiaries. Whenever you have a trust, you have a fiduciary obligation, constitutionally embedded, to protect the asset. And so where does the court come in? The court in a trust case where an asset is not being protected has a limited but very effective role, potentially. And that is to say, it can order a plan for the other branches to protect the asset. So that is the relief sought in the cases all across the United States, not to have the courts jump over the constitutional fence and do what the legislature should be doing, but rather just stepping back and saying, legislatures, you do your job. And executive agencies, you do your job and come up with a plan to protect this asset, to protect the survival of future generations and our children today, and bring that plan to court and show us that you're implementing it. So what is the duty of protection? You might wonder, well, what should they be doing? Well, first of all, there's no plan that's enforceable except in California right now. We'll talk about what opportunity there is in Oregon in a brief moment, but let's talk about what is the obligation to protect. Well, now we have to wade into some science and some math. Here is the best statement of the duty, I think, is in the treaty that was negotiated over climate many years ago to avoid dangerous anthropogenic heating. Well, what is that? Here is where we're at right now, 400 parts per million carbon concentration in the atmosphere. And many of the leading scientists say we have to get back to 350 parts per million. We have to literally come down. And there's ways to do that through natural soil sequestration and reforestation. But one thing we have to do is get our emissions down. We can't possibly have any hope of achieving climate balance if we continue on the fossil fuel path. And so Dr. James Hansen and an international team of scientists and others have said the safe cap on our heating is 1.5 degrees Celsius, and that correlates with something less than 350 parts per million in the atmosphere. Now, are you all, coming along with this? Do you all understand this so far? Okay, I don't want to lose any one of you. Okay, so we're still going to be doing math. So the business as usual curve is that red curve going up. That's if we wake up tomorrow and do the same thing we did today. That takes us right into what scientists predict will be runaway heating. The curve down is where we have to be. What is that as a practical matter? So the Hansen International team of scientists developed a prescription for the planet. And they said we need a 6% global reduction. So 6%, remember that word, or that number, sorry, starting in 2013. So this is math. It's a reduction correlated to a concentration of carbon in the atmosphere. So what we have is carbon math is math in a minute glass because we've got to do it very quickly, and I'll show you why in the next slide. Here's the 6%. Is it still 2013? So, guess what? It's 7% now. Now, had our legislators and our presidents and so forth begun the task, even back in 2005, we would have had to reduce only 3.5%. Now we're at 7. Now, if we wait, here's why the first slide said this is our moment in time. Not our week, not our month, not our year, it's our moment. Because if we wait until 2020, that figure goes up to 15%. Now, at some point, the cuts become too large to feasibly accomplish. And that's when the window closes. So we're in a very difficult situation right now because of the urgency. And many people say, well, they're trying, they're doing little steps. We're trying to take some measures, and that's all very good. We feel good about progressive little measures usually. The problem is a rescue rope that is too short is no good at all. And so the carbon math just has to add up. And what this means is that no jurisdiction can leave an orphan share, because if Oregon doesn't do its part, or Idaho doesn't do its part, it's not as if there's another state out there that can just grab that share and perform it. And so that means that every single city, every single county, every single state, every single nation has to do its share to reduce carbon dioxide. None of the political branches outside of California have stepped up to this task. And that is why the youth of this nation have gone to the courts. Because in 6th grade civics, you probably all learned this nation has 3 branches of government, not 2. And when it comes to constitutional and fundamental rights, particularly where the young people's survival is on the line, that is when the courts can be asked to step in. And so the planet is on the docket in many cases across this country. And here's what the scientists say. They say judicial relief may be the best, the last, and at this late stage, the only real chance to preserve a habitable planet for young people and future generations. Many of the world's most leading scientists are supporting this litigation. So now we get to the action items. What do we do as citizens when faced with this mind-blowing situation? We are in a state of planetary emergency, but you wouldn't know it if you walked outside because things seem pretty much the way they seemed 10 or 20 years ago. But it's all hands on deck time, just like World War II. It's all hands on deck time. And so for citizens that have an understanding of this urgency, they want to know, what's my role? How do I claim my moment? And so the next and last part of this talk will be, how do we respond? And I always go to my 3 C's, citizenship, community, and consumption. So I'll go through with some ideas about how to do this. And you may look at this list and say, well, wait, that's way too much for me. I'll do the consumption, but not the citizenship. Or I'll do the community, but not the consumption. The problem is a really integrated person has to do all 3 because they all synergize together. One leads to another and reinforces another. So let's start with citizenship. It's just amazing what citizenship can do, actually. I've been pretty inspired, incredibly inspired, in the last year. There was a point at which I got to be very jaded, and I think that was because the citizens had really backed out of environmental law for many decades. After Earth Day, people thought things were being taken care of by all those agencies. Now, people are waking up and exercising their fundamental rights. Well, what do we in Oregon do? I really believe that we have a distinctive leverage and role on this planet. And this involves asserting our distinctive regionalism, and I do think we have such a thing. There are several ways we can assert citizenship right now. One is through legislative action, and I'm going to talk about that first because there's some breaking news that I just got updated on before coming into this room. Second is the Oregon ATL case, which I'll talk about. Third is the None Shall Pass campaign. Fourth is local climate action. And fifth is something called the TPP, which many of you probably haven't even heard of yet. Well, maybe many of you have. Okay. Let's start with legislative action. I'm going to just march through these things quickly. I've given a lot of talks in Oregon, and I've never given a talk that had so much potential with an audience before me at a particular time. Never, ever, ever. So, you're it. You are it. I'm a public employee, and so I can explain bills to you. I cannot take a position on bills. So I'm going to explain a bill to you. There is right now a bill in the House Rules Committee called HB 3470, and I'm going to explain its overall mandates. We've never seen anything like this in Oregon because the legislature hasn't come up with it on its own. The legislature takes things sort of as they come in, so they're very occupied with marijuana right now, with the governor's ethics, and things like that. This is something that came out of citizenship, out of Tom Bowerman, and also Our Children's Trust helped immensely draft this bill. And it synergizes exactly with the Oregon Trust case that I talked about. It would create the mandate for the agencies in Oregon to create a comprehensive plan for carbon dioxide reduction that is consistent with that scientific prescription I told you about. And it would require certain checkpoints where the government would have to show it was achieving the carbon reduction according to that prescription. How it chooses to do that is down the road. This is a comprehensive planning framework. You can think of it as You can think of it as like this. We're all on this incredible voyage across a very dangerous, stormy sea, and there's absolutely no plan, no map, no route, no captain. This is creating the mechanism for the government to act in a way that's sensible, to map out the terrain, figure out the options, and figure out the routes, but doesn't actually specify which routes have to be taken. It is parallel to the California bill, which was passed back in 2006, I think, AB 32. And that has actually done had enormous success in reducing carbon dioxide emissions, and also at no cost, no administrative cost to the government. So that particular scheme down in California uses kind of a cap and trade model, which this could use, but doesn't specify it has to use. So we'll talk more about this bill later. It basically is an overall, forcing an overall accounting and an overall plan. This is a fast-moving process. It is right now in the Rules Committee. And for it to have any effect at all as law, it has to, any bill in the Rules Committee then has to somehow get from the Rules Committee to the floor of the House. There's then the process of the Senate, and then being signed by the governor. And so if you consider the time we're all sitting, there's stuff going on in the legislature right now. And the opportunities for citizenship are very high impact because there's no other state except for California that actually has a tangible mandate to reduce carbon dioxide emissions in accordance with the science. So if you want more information on this, Our Children's Trust has the bill posted. I looked all around to see where it can be posted for citizens, and they also have testimony from the House Environment Committee, and you can look at all that on their website. Okay, the second thing I wanted to mention was the Oregon ATL case. We're going to move through these quickly. There is a case right now in Oregon involving Kelsey. The plaintiff is Kelsey Juliana, who you see on this slide, and she has sued the state of Oregon for its failure to have a plan. And that lawsuit was dismissed by a district court or circuit court judge in Eugene a couple of years ago. He was reversed by the Oregon Court of Appeals, and the Oregon Court of Appeals said you have to consider and define the public trust rights of the youth and say what they are. And so last month there was a hearing in the same court. The citizens of Eugene turned out in force for it. There was an overflow room. Busloads of kids came up, and kids just piled out and held signs. You'll see a picture of that in a minute. But it's now the leading case in the country, and the citizens have figured out how they support this kind of litigation through connecting with organizations that are involved, and also through letters to the editor and so forth. This judge will probably issue a judgment, a decision within 2 months, I would imagine. Now, this case is important because it's a domino effect that the plaintiffs are hoping for. Because there's cases positioned all across the country and now across the world as well, a declaration by an Oregon judge as to the atmospheric trust rights would have enormous influence and impact on other cases and petitions pending. Here are the kids that piled out to demonstrate. Kelsey Juliana was on PBS NewsHour. She was also on the Bill Moyer Show, and I love her quote here. And this can be hard for me to read, but I'm going to do it. Let's see. As a youth, you can probably read it better than I can. She's got everything to gain from taking action and everything to lose from not. I thought that quote was so brilliant in terms of how she summed up the youth's position in climate crisis. And I was also on the Bill Moyer Show, and you can find both episodes if you would like. Mine discusses the public trust, and hers discusses more of the Oregon case, and they're both available on the web. There are cases across the world now asserting similar rights. There's one in Netherlands that was argued a couple of weeks ago, and it was brought on behalf of hundreds of Netherlands citizens, and they marched in the streets. And so those lawsuits are very much connected, and people are figuring out that courts have a responsibility as a last resort to force government to act before it's too late. So that was the second item on the list. The third item was the none shall pass. How do citizens engage in this whole movement, None Shall Pass. That's directed towards the fossil fuel projects, the ones I showed you. There were 16 on the list. I think we could look at this two ways. We could look at it one way as this fossil fuel industry has our region under siege. You could certainly look at it that way. The other way of looking at it is this region, which is not a fossil fuel region and has a distinctive regionalism and I think understanding of natural laws, the laws of nature, has incredible leverage over a global fossil fuel distribution scheme. And so citizens are rising. They're actually swarming through democratic means and through showing up at hearings and also actually through some direct actions. They are swarming every single one of those projects, much of it coordinated by Rising Tide in various places. But here's some citizens at a hearing. I want to tell you how much one citizen can make a difference. There's a school teacher up in Vancouver, Washington named Don Steinke. And he's a retired school teacher. He has single-handedly organized thousands of citizens into an email list, and he alerts people when there's a hearing for a permit, and people just turn out. When he calls, they come. It's his army. And this is just one guy who is a school teacher. So there have been victories. There was a victory against one of the proposals, Amber Energy. There's been some others as well, but this is just a constant process. And of course, the worry is that it splits the citizens up so much. And so that is why citizens are just swarming. People are picking a project and just paying attention to at least one. The next thing on your citizen list was local action. In Eugene, Oregon, we got city council to pass a local ordinance that provides for a carbon emissions reduction plan that has to be tied to the science. And so we're doing with that Oregon State bill on a local level, basically, in Eugene. It's an incredible achievement. It's the first in the nation, I think, that really takes the science and forces a carbon emissions reduction plan. This was the people so excited after that victory. And you can see there's a lot of kids there. This happened because little kids and older kids showed up month after month after month after month after month with homework, with soccer jerseys and muddy shoes and snacks, and they testified. Once a month, they came out and they testified, and some of them, even fell asleep waiting for the hearing to end, but they were there to testify month after month. And it's my feeling that the children have the real moral authority, and that these city councilors could not look those children in the eye and ignore this crisis when they were pleading for government to take responsibility. And, this day felt really good to those children because I speak a lot at schools, and I can tell you one thing. The kids know this stuff. So they know, and they're frightened. And they learn it. And then they go home and they see people ignoring it. And the most frightening thing for a kid is just to have the adults not do anything. And so on a day like this was incredibly empowering to the community, and it's had a real effect in Eugene. And as I understand it, there are efforts in these other cities, Corvallis, Bend, and Portland at least, and these are all coordinated by the organization Our Children's Trust. They have done youth leadership camps, and they have coordinated testimony and are working, and I think we have Nick Caleb in the audience from Our Children's Trust, who's coordinating these efforts in these other cities. Final citizenship action, then we're going to kind of bring this to a close pretty quickly. The Trans-Pacific Partnership, I can't tell you much about it because it's been secret, but it's a huge trade agreement, and multinational corporations have been negotiating it behind the public's eye with the government. And our own Senator Wyden has been one of the lead proponents and moved a bill through the Senate to fast track this. So it is on a very fast track. Again, I can't tell you much about it because the negotiations have been in secret. I can tell you one thing. It seems to me it is an affront and violates the public trust, because the public trust says in that Illinois Central Opinion, which I put up for you several slides ago now, said government may not abdicate its sovereignty over crucial resources belonging to the public. And so for all these projects I mentioned with all these permits, and I said you citizens can show up and you can try to stop these projects, well, this partnership agreement kind of puts that into question as to whether or not localities could actually have the autonomy to stop projects. So that would be taking the sovereignty of the people and putting it into an international committee made up of other people, some of which are designated, I understand, by the corporations themselves. So keep your eye on this. It's moving fast. I'm not an expert on it, but it is definitely something that comes up in conversations every day. And the final two things after citizenship were community and consumption. For community, two things. We need to communicate climate, and we also need to initiate real change in our communities. So let me deal with those just very briefly. Communicating climate. In World War II, there was a huge threat, and people were kind of like we are today. They just didn't know it. They didn't appreciate it, didn't know how grave the threat was. And so actually, government was on the people's side and organized a whole group of victory speakers. How many of you have heard of victory speakers, by the way? Well, that's good. A lot of you have. Well, a lot of you have just been to my speeches where I was okay. Anyway, and so there were victory speakers across this country. And if you look at historical accounts, these were people, just ordinary people who were trusted in their communities, like all of you. I hope all of you are trusted in your communities. Just ordinary people who went out and just got the word out that there's a real threat and here's what you can do. And these people were not professional speakers, but they made speeches in every form they could find, in PTA meetings, in movie theaters. And I know a little bit about this because my grandmother and my mother were both victory speakers. And do you know Oregon had the most vibrant victory speaker league in the whole country? And if you look at historical accounts, many say the war that this nation would not have been able to mobilize overnight as it did were it not for those victory speakers. And so I always advocate for all of us to be the climate victory speakers. And we don't have to go into movie theaters necessarily. We can use the internet. But I think it's time to start going into movie theaters, perhaps. Anyway, there's many victory speakers, some in our own midst. Kathleen Dean Moore, such a marvelous, let's give her a hand. OSU professor and author extraordinaire and a huge inspiration, speaking all over the place on climate. Bill McKibben, who influenced that DA, leads the 350 movement. Naomi Klein just wrote a fabulous book called This Changes It All. Here's one of the plaintiffs. There's many of them in the OCT, Our Children's Trust litigation campaign. They're all across the country, and they're all going and speaking in their communities. We even have the Pope. Pope is getting involved. And so what's the second thing? Besides speaking and taking the message out and waking people up, as they did back then, community also means taking initiative to create new systems. A lot of this will come down to business, to these entrepreneurs that will see an opportunity to make a change in the community and find the funding, the investment. My point here is just vision something, anything, but try to move something along in terms of sustainable living, because government cannot do it all. Certainly government isn't leading very well at the state or national level, but even the local governments are trying to do so much. They can't possibly do all of what needs to be done. And so citizen initiative is so very important. One thing you can all do is try to find more space to create community gardens. And there's a marvelous book called The Transition Handbook, which talks about transition towns all across this world doing just that. Well, I said there were 3 C's. We're at the last one. It was citizenship, community. Last one is consumption. I do believe in Gandhi's famous words, live simply so that others may simply live. Although I've modified them, live simply so that our children may simply live. But we haven't been doing that for decades since World War II. In fact, our culture does the opposite. And this is what has resulted: mountains and mountains of waste. Now, there's a problem with all this, because just put climate out of your minds. Take a break, okay, for 15 seconds. Take a break. Pretend climate didn't even exist. We would still be in awful shape, because we would need 2 planets by 2030 to maintain our level of consumption. In other words, our resources, even apart from climate, cannot stand our growth and consumption. So what does that mean? Well, this is a very personal thing. It means personal change, because we can have all the government programs we want, but unless we change personally, things aren't going to happen in terms of a path forward. And so I think we are, and I sure know a lot of you in Corvallis are, and Eugene too, the new Oregon pioneers. We're pioneers in local food and simple living and bicycle transportation. And I think we have a lot to show to the rest of the country in very good ways, because if you start this path of simple living, you find you have a new relationship with time altogether, and it's fulfilling to have community. You reclaim part of your life. That does mean producing your own food if you can. See all these wonderful jars that I canned? I actually didn't can these ones, but I can about 500 jars a year for my family. I'll teach anyone who wants to know. And I bake bread 3 times a week. I make our own yogurt. The reason I bake bread is because I don't like that plastic bag that the bread comes in. The reason I make my own yogurt, because I don't like the plastic containers, because all of that is filled with petroleum product. And so it does mean going back and becoming a food producer. Saves packaging, allows us to eat locally. But what I like best of all about it, the best, it liberates us from corporate control, because I don't want corporations having control over food. And so we've come to the end, and we have a future ahead, and it will be one of these futures. Which future? Literally, only this generation has the power to decide. Because of those tipping points and feedback loops, if we miss this moment in time, we do lock in the future on the left. And so what Terry Tempest Williams says, which always resonates with me, is the eyes of the future are looking back at us, and they are praying for us to see beyond our own time. We have in this state a legacy unlike any other state in the country. We have a culture unlike any other state or people in the country. And I know that all of us share one understanding, otherwise you wouldn't be here tonight, that together we hold not the power of life, but the trust of life. Thank you.